we've got a nerf of sorts at least. Discover and random generation both being adjusted, or actually have already been adjusted. This is live in Hearthstone right now. Discover cards can no longer discover themselves, and cards that generate random stuff can no longer generate themselves. So no longer do you have, say, a nature studies for druid that turns into another nature study, that turns into a nature studies, that turns into nature studies, and your opponent had an exotic mount on board and got like 4 minions extra because they chained nature studies forever. Or I think we've seen this a lot with like the explorer dragon cards. You play a 6/8 druid, it discovers you a 6/8 taunt, and you play that and it discovers you a 6/8 taunt, and it just goes on seemingly endlessly, creating some really bad moments for the opponent where it's just like these infinite resources. It seems like you just keep having to deal with the same thing over and over again, and your opponent never really loses any resources along the way. They're just chaining stuff together. So that wasn't always happening, but occasionally those moments would pop up and they'd feel really, really bad. So the big question is, does this make Discover and random generators worse? Well, in some cases, yeah, I think they get a little tiny bit worse. I mean, they're still going to be great cards because you weren't always discovering reloads or the same card over and over again anyway. And in some cases, you can still create chains where, you discover another Discover card and it turns into something cool. So it's a very small subset of instances where this is going to have an impact on games. But I do think it makes Hearthstone feel way better, which is really important because those moments could be pretty disastrous when they happen to you, even though they were pretty fun when they happened for you. So I think ultimately it's a good change that will impact some cards. That said, I wanted to take a look at some of the most prominent Discover and random cards right now to see just what kind of impact we might expect. All right, so speaking of those cards, I'm on HS Replay right now, checking out the most played cards with Discover in their text. This is Diamond through Legend ranks the last 3 days, and number one, perhaps no surprise, Nature Studies, one I already talked about. And I think the cards is the single most important card for this change, and probably the one most negatively impacted. It's the one study that discounts itself, which was creating those loops where you'd get 3 or 4 in a row. Crazy things would happen. And this impacts both Mount Seller interactions and Kael'thas interactions, making it harder to find kind of a bonus spell off of Nature Studies that is also just played for free. So you get a true bonus mixed in otherwise in the mix of all your other spells. So that's a huge change. It's not going to make Guardian Druid like terrible or anything. It's just going to tiny impact on the win rate, pulling it down a few tenths of a percentage or something, which is great. That's exactly the kind of things we want. Small adjustments. Now moving on, some of these aren't relevant, right? Like if they're specifically coded, Wand Thief can't discover itself anyway. So it's kind of in our search filter here, but Wand Thief not impacted. Renew, on the other hand, is a pretty impactful one because sometimes Priest could say heal 6 or 9 health off of multiple renews chaining into themselves. That's going to go away with Renew, which is another big change, keeping Priests from like those crazy stabilization turns where they just get like 9 extra healing at no cost and still get to discover an awesome spell at the end of the chain. We've also got Magic Trick. Sometimes mages would use this to cycle multiple instances with like a Chinvala on board or Mana Cyclones or help it to reduce their Mana Giants. So this will slightly affect those decks as well, and this is obviously being utilized in those right now. So a small hit to the kind of Mana Cyclone tempo mage out there. So we've got Priest impacted, Spell Druid, Guardian Druid, and Mana Cyclone Mage impacted. And then most of these don't actually interact with themselves. They don't discover themselves or anything. They discover subsets other than themselves. But here we start with the Explorers, like Emerald Explorer. Another example I already cited. Just getting all those 4/8 bodies can go a long way. This will prevent you from chaining Explorers into Explorers. So this is not only in Druid, but we've also got the other Explorers as well, Hunter, Paladin, Mage, and maybe I'm forgetting one, but I think that's it. So a pretty big change there. That's not going to be something that's affecting any one particular deck, but just those small instances here and there. Maybe an Arena it could have a big change too, as far as I know. Don't play Arena right now. But that's a good change too, because I know that felt really, really bad, particularly with Emerald Explorer. When it comes to random cards as opposed to Discover cards, which we're looking at right now, I think there are fewer impactful cards here. We've got things like Lightforged Crusader. Won't be able to add Lightforged Crusader card to its hand, presumably. I didn't feel like that was something that was happening very often in Pure Paladin anyway, but maybe occasionally that prevents the Paladin from reloading a second time, which might be nice. We've got, more importantly perhaps though, is Evocation here. Now Evocation cannot give you another Evocation, which sometimes if you had the right Sorcerer's Apprentice set up or Mozaki set up, you could like totally empty your hand of the first Evocation, or most of it anyway, 6-7 spells, and then you get another one to reload again, and then you dump another 5 or 6 spells because they're all so cheap that it would work out nicely. So no longer are you going to be able to chain Evocations, which I think that is probably a pretty important change. And again, limiting Tempo Mage just a little bit. I don't think this ever kills any of these decks. Just pulls down their power spikes a little, and that's a good thing. Of course, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza shows up here. Dragon Queen Alexstrasza already had this change made previously, individually coded to herself. It's now being extended, of course, to every other Discover or random card. So thanks, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, for setting the precedent here that now is having a positive impact on everything else. We've also got Sky Raider here, which could give you a Sky Raider. I don't think this is a huge impact. You weren't super thrilled to get the Sky Raider in some cases anyway, but very occasionally Sky Barge would get like an extra proc because of Sky Raider. So that's another one where, sure, totally fine, but not a big impact on anybody that's running Sky Raider. And finally, after months and months, the nerf we've all been waiting for, Dune Sculptor, a card that you totally remember existed, will no longer be able to add a Dune Sculptor to your hand, preventing the abominable Dune Sculptor chains that we've all been tormented by for years and years on end. Thank you, Blizzard, for this based change. Dune Sculptor is no more. And on that note, I think that's really most of the important cards here that are getting impacted, some of the decks that are getting impacted. At the end of the day, a good change for the health of the game, I'm sure, but not a huge change from a competitive standpoint as far as I'm concerned. I don't think decks are getting like hardcore nerfed because of this change. Just small tweaks here and there, so keep an eye on them. Don't expect crazy outs off renew, etc. And just keep an eye on these rules changing as you play, because it's going to be important to know from finding your outs and how to play certain things, but probably not the biggest meta impact. And as far as I'm concerned, a good positive change for the game. I think that's a healthy one that's removing some frustrating moments without totally ruining people's decks or anything of the sort. So good job, Blizz, on this one. That said, share your thoughts on this in the comments below. If you were super pumped to get multiple Dune Sculptors, let me know. Sorry to hear that, but I think you'll survive. If you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe. I don't care. It's cool if you do, but as long as you're watching, it's fine too. So thanks much for watching. Occasionally, thanks for subscribing if you're out there. And until next time, game on.